Well, good morning, everyone. We're waiting for a few more people to enter, and then we'll start the meeting. When we scheduled this event, we didn't realize just how timely it would be. So I think you're all in for a very great and timely presentation. So. Oh, good. That's Jackie. All right. Well, I think we'll get started. First, I want to welcome you to the FEI. This is a presentation on vaccine mandates. And Rob Duston from Saul Ewing is going to be doing the presentation. But before we get started, I'd like to announce the future events that we're going to have. On October 13th, we have our first live in-person meeting at Interlinks at Columbia. It's going to be a very, we haven't had that since, gosh, a year and a half now. And Graham, are you there? Can you unmute yourself, Graham?
I am, Joe. Good afternoon.
Can you tell us some exciting things about your client there, Interlinks?
Yeah, Intralytics is a company born and raised here in Maryland that focuses on bacteriophage technology. It has a lot of similarities to things like probiotics and things of that nature, and has a lot of applications, not only as a potential future consumable to help people with various, essentially gastrointestinal illnesses, but also a lot of applications in industrial food production and food safety. So fascinating company, very strong management team, and should be a great presentation.
And Libs Grills Catering, and so it should be also a delight, as well as informative and entertaining. Then on November 4th, we're going to be meeting Kim Golden, who's the president of the Baltimore Chamber Orchestra, and he's going to talk about how their organization worked through COVID. And I think it's interesting. This is one of the performing arts ones, the local one, same as the BSO, but certainly equally as important. And they're going to tell you how they navigated through COVID. And then on December 8th, we're going to have the role of the internal auditors and financial oversight in nonprofit and religious organizations. This is going to be presented by Paul Douglas. He is the CFO and treasurer for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And that is just really one of a huge organization here in Maryland, headquartered in Silver Spring. So I think that should be a very interesting and very pertinent topic for our members. Right now, I'd like to introduce Jackie Brooks. She is one of our FEI sponsors, and she's going to talk about Saul Ewing and introduce Rob Duston, her colleague. Jackie?
Thanks, Joe. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here. So Saul Ewing, which is a sponsor of for this FEI event and was FEI of the Baltimore chapter, is a 375 plus attorney law firm with 16 offices. And Saul Ewing it's a full service law firm that offers the national reach and sophisticated experience of a large law firm and the local connections and value of a boutique firm. And so our attorneys focus on 3 core values that are practiced every day, which are knowing our clients' industries, businesses, challenges, and goals, developing and expanding our client relationships by putting our clients first, and collaborating with each other to benefit and cross-serve our clients. And so in that collaboration, I've worked a lot with Rob Duston, who will talk with you and give you this timely information on employers, employees, and COVID and all that is currently happening right now. And so with to ensure that Rob has all the time that he needs, I will turn it over to Rob.
Thank you, Jackie. A couple more introductory comments just to help place who I am, where I am. Sitting in the house in near Dulles Airport because we are still, primarily remote and are going to be until January. We just got that latest word. Recently got named office managing partner of the DC office when the office managing partner left. And don't say congrats, say condolences, because now I get to see whether or not any of my advice to clients actually works in getting people back into offices and keeping them safe. So that is going to be my task over the next few months. Was raised in Northern Virginia, law school at UVA. Joined this firm when it was a small boutique and basically haven't moved since 1985 after I started after a clerkship. and came into all of this because I was an employment law attorney. I do a lot of higher education work and I do a lot of ADA work nationwide and have a national practice in that. And lo and behold, that was the perfect storm for navigating COVID employment issues, was knowing employment law and disabilities law and public accommodations. And I am being informally called by others our vaccine guru. And I will be glad when that title disappears and we don't need a vaccine guru. But in the meantime, I am one of the multiple people who are just doing a lot of COVID-19 advice. And we did our first presentation, I think, on March 3rd, 2019, just a week or two before the closure started. And so we've been doing work in the space extensively ever since. And the questions are just coming hot and heavy every day. So with that, I'm just going to jump on in and start the presentation. Presentation, I assume Denise will tell you, will be available. We are taking questions in the chat box during, and I'm going to try to save time at the end for audible questions. I may or may not, given the amount of material and the time, stop and pause and see if anybody wants to unmute and ask questions as we go along. I regularly do that when we're in person, a little more awkward on Zoom, but we'll be checking the chat box and we'll be doing audible questions later. So with that, let me go ahead and get started. Okay. So where to start? We're going to start with polls. I know you guys like polls and have to do polls for continuing ed. So here is the first one. I want to get a feel for where you are right now. So go ahead and respond to this one, and we'll give you a minute. Okay, looks like things are paused. That is exactly what I would have anticipated right now. That some percentage of, you can see this, essential workers, a third back completely, and another third hybrid. Those are in your industry, that's not surprising that relatively few at this point are 100% remote in the area. Let's go ahead and close that on out. So let's start. The focus today is actually going to be on vaccine mandates, but let me just sort of start with an even bigger overview. We are all struggling with COVID-19 safety issues, and we have throughout. This is just the latest evolution of where we are as far as what the best practices are to keep our employees safe. Throughout this time, the mantra has always been, when you talk about what we do at home, what we do with our offices, is to follow the science. And follow the science means primarily following CDC guidelines, unless the state or local requirements are even greater. And that was true for what your protocols were if you were opening up 6 months or a year, or some of you may have been open since as soon as you were allowed in April, May of 2020. So we follow the science. And then we followed it when it came to social distancing and masking, and we all were overjoyed when the masks came off, and then had to, and disappointed when they had to come on. And we'd hoped that we were all going to be done by now with vaccination. The biggest thing we are continuing to deal with right now is COVID exhaustion of everybody, those who are remote, those who are in the office. We're not going to have time today to do a whole lot of return to work issues on getting people back and hybrid issues. The focus really is on the safety side today. But it was until in January, February, March, when we were doing presentations, or even in late spring, we were being cautious, and most of our clients were being cautious about vaccine mandates. First, it was hard to even get access to the vaccination, and then it was slow and crowded. But the EEOC came out with their guidance that is still good. Back in last December, they anticipated a lot of the issues we're dealing with right now, and some that they haven't. But their guidance is driving a lot of the advice and decision-making by lawyers. So here's where we are right now. It really is a case where the whole field has changed, the whole attitude has changed. 6 months ago, we were all worried about the status of the vaccines in emergency use. That's largely a moot point at this point. You've got one vaccine approved, you've got the other one that will be approved soon. J&J is coming on out, and it is likely to get final approval within a couple months. But we are dealing right now with the new requirements that are going to come out that the federal government announced that we're going to go through in a few minutes. And of those employers who have already asked for, mandated things, they are encountering all kinds of hurdles. And we're going to talk about some of those issues and lessons learned. And a huge caution that still most people are feeling is, which is going to be worse, alienating my vaccinated employees who may not want to return to the office or who are really uncomfortable around their unvaccinated colleagues, or impose some kind of mandate and risk losing talent that I can't afford to lose. And what does that mean if I start imposing mandates and consequences and create two classes of employees? It feels like it's going to be discrimination against one class. So I want to introduce two concepts. I credit some of my colleagues who sort of came up with the labels for these. A vaccine mandate, when we think about it as lawyers of any kind of mandate, what we're calling a CAP-M or a hard mandate is you get vaccinated or you're going to be fired, period. And yes, you got to have religious and medical exemptions. We'll talk about those. But that really is a hard mandate. And a truly hard mandate is saying for everybody from the president on down to the bottom, and even remote workers, we are going to require vaccination, period, unless you have an exemption, and then figure out what you do with the people with exemptions. Anything else that you do requiring vaccine documentation for some activities, for some events, for some purposes, for coming in the office, is what I call a soft mandate. And it can go anywhere from you can't have any in-person contact with any of our customers or clients, to as little as you got to wear masks in the office and you got to stay out, or you've got to continue working remote, to which some employers are going to say, great, that's what I want to do anyway. A range of things, and we'll talk about that. The two new federal executive orders that we're going to cover in a couple of minutes more, really, and we only know so much about them right now. We know what has been in the announcements, but the first one for federal employees and for federal contractors appears to be a hard mandate. It looks like, absent exceptions, federal contractors and federal employees will lose their jobs or not be able to work on contracts unless they are vaccinated. We think that's the answer. We're going to know a whole lot more this Friday on the federal contract side. And the executive order that OSHA is going to implement, it, people are already talking about it as the OSHA rule, is only for larger companies. And it appears to be a soft mandate. It looks like either employees will have the choice or employers will have the choice to either mandate or have to do mandatory testing. And we're not quite sure what that's going to look like. So poll number 2, take a look at this for a second before Denise puts it on up. Want to know, and this is a check all that applies. Where are you? Okay, this is interesting with this group. So come take a look at that. We've got the incentive issues, and people have been encouraging and doing incentives for many months. Tracking and using for some purposes, it might be particular events. We'll drill down on what that probably is. But very low among the group here today on requiring proof for in-person activities. And no one yet mandating testing. And there are lots of reasons why you may be holding off on that. And a very small percentage with a hard mandate. And if I were to have asked the question differently, how many of you are thinking about doing the other things? I think the numbers would be a whole lot higher, and that's why you're here today. So let's go forward then. So the quick answer to can you is the answer is you can, except in a very small number of states as of right now. You know, there's a long history of mandatory vaccines. Some of you may have seen, it was the poster, the journal last week that did a piece on the history of vaccine mandates going back to George Washington mandating smallpox vaccines for his troops, and a lot of cities and counties mandating smallpox vaccine back in the 1700s. There's been a long history of it. There was a lot of litigation and a lot of discussion of this back in the 1917-18 influenza pandemic. And the quick answer is employer, unless a state limits that right, and historically few, if any, states have, you've got the right to require vaccinations. And there's a long history of it in many industries. And state law may require it in some places for some kinds of employees, not typically in financial services. Now, there are some states that have already passed some restrictions. Most of those are limited to state and local employers. There are a handful out west in the South. I mean, I think it's 2 now or 3 that have some limits on what private employers can do. Montana made being unvaccinated a protected class and amended their human rights law. But absent, and there's a lot of bills being passed in every state in the union. There is legislation that was proposed last year or is pending to protect the unvaccinated and to bar, vaccine passports. By the way, vaccine passports is a terrible name for what it is, for what it's called, but it's basically the requirement of vaccination either to come to work or to come to certain events or do something else. And there's a lot of legislation out there that hasn't passed yet. But by and large, you can do it, and you can impose it just like putting in a new minimum requirement for employment or a new safety rule or anything else you want to do. You announce it and you tell people that they have to do it as a condition of employment, and there it is. And people who don't like it will end up walking. And you just have to comply with other laws, including Title VII and the ADA. As I mentioned, the main restriction on doing any kind of requirements derives from federal law. Maryland human rights laws would be interpreted consistently with this. Actually, the human rights laws of DC, Maryland, Virginia, or any place else you're operating will be consistent with the EEOC guidance typically. And we're going to talk about this later about the need for accommodations or exemptions under the ADA and under Title VII for people with disability or religious reasons why they can't get vaccinated. As I mentioned up front, the concerns about liability over experimental vaccinations or the fact that the vaccines were under an emergency use authorization, those have all but disappeared. There are some great cases favorable to this. And a lot of those claims are based on you are forcing, this is involuntary vaccination, you are forcing me to be vaccinated. This is like medical experimentation on prisoners. And the answer has always been historically, and the courts are saying this, no, it's not. If you don't get vaccinated, I can't force you to, but you're not going to see these kind of clients, or you won't be working for us. You can go work elsewhere. You're going to face consequences. And that is not considered to be illegal or a violation of anybody's rights. They can just walk away and not get the vaccine if they choose to. Your industry doesn't tend to be very heavily unionized. When there are union employees in the mix, there's always collective bargaining issues, National Reliable Relations Act issues where you have to discuss these issues. Some contracts, people can go ahead and mandate, some they can't. If you've got unions, you probably have already looked at this and know, how far you have to go, or that you might need to deal with the union on some of those issues. So let's talk about the new executive orders, what we know and don't know. The first details for federal contractors, I am guessing that a percentage of you are direct contractors to the federal government, and a number of you have clients that are going to be federal government contractors. It's the nature of our area, a lot of federal contractors, and some of you are. We are going to get details on that this Friday. The initial task force report is going to come out. It won't have formal rules yet, but we'll know the direction that they're going. The OSHA is going to come out with an emergency temporary standard. We don't know when, nobody knows. And so what we're making here is educated guesses. What we know from some initial press interviews is that federal contract and presentation last week, federal contractors and subs are going to be treated the same as federal employees. And there are going to be new federal procurement rules. All new federal government contracts going forward will have COVID-19 mandates for all employees. And there is likely going to be a modification of all existing contracts. It's going to be one set of rules across all agencies that are being coordinated right now through OMB, and it'll be a vaccine mandate. What we don't know, and we know that contractors that are just providing products are going to be excluded. We don't know much more. We do know that federal government grantees, other recipients of federal financial assistance are not covered. What we don't know is who in those contracts is going to be required to get vaccinated. Typically, rules like this would apply to those working on the contract and those supporting the contract, but we don't know. We don't know what those will do. Particularly, we don't know whether it'll be 100% remote. In theory, these contract rules could say that all employees, if you want to work for the federal government, everyone, or you're a sub working for a federal government contractor, every one of your employees, regardless of where they are or whether they're remote, have to be vaccinated. That would be a bit of a surprise, but it could be done. We don't know when it'll take effect and what the options are if suddenly the feds say, as a result of this, key employees are on the contract and you can no longer perform your contract. So there's a lot of questions that these rules are going to have to answer. We'll get some answers on Friday, but probably not enough. With OSHA, we have even more questions. For those of you who are 100 plus, and this is going to be 100 plus anywhere in the country, if you are 100 plus employees, how to count to 100, we've got lots of examples in other laws, FMLA, EEO1 requirements. But the big question, and you just can't tell, we know that the president said he wants to see more vaccination. Now, the way that the executive order is written, it seems to imply that employees might have a choice to get tested rather than get vaccinated. That would seem sort of contrary to what the president wants to do. If the regulation says, at a minimum, you must vaccinate or require weekly testing. But you have the choice to just do a hard mandate with no testing. That will advance the number of vaccinated employees. If, on the other hand, employees can say, I don't want to be vaccinated, I'll agree to get tested, then you may get 20%, 30% more people agreeing to get tested, but I mean, agreeing to get vaccinated. So we just don't know the answer to that. And the related issue is, what does that mean for religious and medical exemptions? If employers are permitted to have a true mandate and not do testing, then they're going to have to do exemptions in accordance with the EOC rules. But if it's a either or, you may not need medical exemptions for those who are getting vaccinated. You'd only have to get them for those who have medical objections to testing. And I probably mentioned this in a slide later, but we are being inundated with religious and medical exemptions requests from those who have it out there. And many of these, or at least some of them, are objecting to vaccination, objecting to masking, objecting to testing, objecting to basically anything on religious grounds. So OSHA is going to have to confront all kinds of issues that we're going to talk about in this presentation. The types of tests, who pays for them, informed consent, confidentiality. There was some of this in a prior OSHA rule that was issued several months ago for healthcare entities, but OSHA may or may not follow that. So we really don't know. Now, my understanding is that the vast majority of you are going to be under 100 employees, and so are not going to be covered that, and that probably most of you are not also going to fall in the direct federal government contractor stage. But all the same issues that are going to be in the OSHA rules and in the government contractor rules are the same issues you will have to decide on your own. You can look to these testing rules for guidance, but if you're under 100, you are not going to have to follow them. So, poll number 3, see if my guess is right. Based on what we know, how will your company be affected by these? Okay, so my guesses have been a little bit wrong. About half of you here today are in the large employer 100 plus only, and yeah, a much smaller number are federal contractors, and that would overlap with the 100 plus. And a much smaller percentage who are on the call today are in the under 100. So since that is the case, as I go through, let me go back to those issues for a second. Yep. So I'm gonna flag these issues again for all of you who are covered by the OSHA rule. We really, you may have heard that OSHA didn't even know this was coming out until like a day or two before the president announced it. We also know from recent experience, OSHA has been decimated during the last administration with departures. Enforcement is way down because the number of enforcers is way down. And OSHA has tended on everything during COVID to be very cautious and take a long time to develop anything. The healthcare ETS took months to put out. OSHA is going to be under very tight, expectations to come out with something soon. And that's not what they naturally do, is operate quickly, particularly for an emergency rule. So it is possible that these things may be rolling out in bits and pieces, and that certain pieces of it may come out soon. My educated guess is that, and it's pretty safe to say on September 22nd, that we're not going to see a rule by October 1st. I will not be surprised if the ETS does not come out until November 1st, and then it's going to have some kind of time lag on when it's going to come out. They always give some kind of timeline, but for But the emergency rule will probably say, starting immediately, you must develop and must have in place within 30, 60, 90 days, something like that, a program that complies with the following rules as the new rules. And sooner or later, they are going to have to address each of these issues. So when we talk about the specifics later, we are thinking about all of the rules that apply and discretion apply for smaller employers are things that you need to be thinking about as large employers, informing, and in many cases, I think you will be given discretion. For example, you may be told, OSHA may say, you can use any type of test that is approved by the CDC. You must follow EEOC guidelines on confidentiality. You must follow CDC guidelines on informed consent. And your program must address all of this. That would be the easiest way for them to do an emergency temporary standard, is to cross-reference other rules and then say you can decide what you're going to do, what other rules you're going to impose for those who do not get vaccinated, and give you discretion. So I think that's the direction they're going to go. So let's just jump into, I'll change the title to actually decision-making on whether to mandate. And let's assume for this discussion that the EEOC, that OSHA gives you the option for larger employers to either go with the bare minimum of vaccinate or weekly testing, or impose a hard mandate. You might not have that option, but let's assume that that is. And for all of the smaller employers, for the government contractors, you're not going to be given any choices. But for the rest of you, you may have options. So absent any other law, your decision-making on whether to mandate, the first step is actually to figure out who's vaccinated. And it is very important if you have not done so. It sounds like a number of you have, because you're using vaccination for some purposes and not others. But if you haven't surveyed your employees, before you think about what you're doing next, you need to do that. It's legal under the ADA as long as you keep the vaccine cards or information confidential. And you need to do it to have an assessment of what's going to happen depending on what your policy looks like. If you are thinking of, we're going to impose a vaccine mandate or else fire people, you need to know if some of your top managers, any of your vice presidents, some of your top salespeople, whatever that may be, key employees, are in fact anti-vax and you didn't know it, and are so firmly opposed that they may go ahead and walk. You need to get a handle on how many of your employees are vaccinated already, to sort of do the other planning, and why. Now it's it's easy to have a mandatory survey. Are you vaccinated or are you not? Are you planning to be get vaccinated by XYZ date? Or are you not planning to get vaccinated at all? And just record the responses. What you really want to know is the why. And vaccine hesitancy still exists in all kinds of pockets of people. You may find this more often in your support staff than professionals, but there will be people who are still vaccine hesitant despite all the information and knowledge. And some of those are going to be pushed to get a vaccine if there's a mandate, or they can be convinced. Maybe the incentives encouraging you hasn't worked yet, but you still may be able to do those. There are some questions you can ask in the initial survey, but I often find that it's better to figure out who's not vaccinated and then work one-on-one to ask the questions. Why, what information, what are their concerns? People respond better to sort of soft, not to coercion. Anybody who's unvaccinated right now, any that feels like coercion or you're beating them up is not going to get anywhere. But gentle trying to probe at the whys. And along the way, you're going to figure out that there are some people who are so strongly anti-COVID vaccine that they're just going to leave. And you need to know who those are. And some of those people may surprise you. So I probably have this in a later slide, but there was a post-ABC News poll that came out just before the Biden announcement of unvaccinated employees. And this was a nationwide poll. And roughly 20% said that if there was a mandate, they would get vaccinated. Around 40% said they were going to be seeking medical or religious exemptions. And the other 40% said that they would walk. Now, if every employer with more than 100 is able to do a hard or soft mandate, maybe they won't walk. But these are some of the decision making you need to do. It is, oh, here's the poll. This is a cost benefit issue. So you need to compare those that might leave to how many of your vaccinated employees would quit or would stay remote if they could, because they don't want to work around unvaccinated employees. We can do everything appropriate to reduce risks in the workplace. You can have social distancing, you can have proper wearing of masks, you can do weekly testing of unvaccinated employees and follow all the best practices, and you will still have employees who have visceral reactions to working around unvaccinated employees, and given a choice, they will not work next to them. And that is an irrational fear scientifically, because the risks are far greater when you go out to a restaurant and take off your mask or go to the grocery store. But it's a reality. And you have to acknowledge, the number of unvaccinated people who don't want to work around vaccinated ones. So, quick poll on your options for things to do on vaccination. This is a multiple choice. What's legal? Is that poll working there, Denise? Oh, well, people are just taking their time. Got it. All right, that looks pretty close to everybody. I've seen. All right, providing extra paid leave, overwhelming, cash incentives for new vaccination. Yeah, 2/3 of you. Premium discounts, half. That's people have been reading the news about Delta Airlines, and denying paid leave to unvaccinated people. Okay. So let's talk about these. So you'll be happy to know incentives are illegal. It took the EEOC forever to get guidance on vaccine incentives, but providing incentives for those who are vaccinated or those who provide documentation is fine. If you, the only place where you have to have a question mark is if you're encouraging them to get vaccinations from you. And I don't think that this audience is going to be doing too many vaccinations in the office with your people. Some of these may be taxable, and then you raise questions about sort of other risks. So popular incentives, and the ones that have at least initially worked best, were those that covered the reasons that most people were saying they had not gotten around to the vaccination yet. And surveys, lots of different surveys show, often it was concerns about leave and time off, either the time to get a vaccine, and this is particularly among lower wage workers who are reporting this in a wide variety of industries. So additional paid leave that covers not only the time getting the vaccine, which apparently is going to be part of the OSHA rule as well. But a lot of folks are concerned about side effects and losing work if they have side effects. And those are natural. We've all known people who were flat on their backs for a week, and some people who had nothing more than a sore arm. And I was on the far end of that bell curve as far as side effects that lasted a while. Didn't interrupt work after a while. But for people who are concerned, giving extra leave, paid leave, just for side effects so they don't have to dip into everything else is something that you could do and would work. A surprising number of people talk about transportation. They don't want to go on public transportation. They don't want to take Ubers. And so it's sort of difficult or limited getting to. Cash bonuses. Nobody has figured out the dollar amount that will work best in order to get people vaccinated. But there was something today about $1,000 seems to be a magic number to get a certain number of people to get vaccinated finally. And of course, in this industry, those are all taxable, and you have a big issue if you only offer them going forward, because everybody who did the right thing up front is wondering why they didn't get the bonus. Now, I'm completely amused that when Delta Airlines came out with all of their discussion of what they were planning to do in their wellness program, they are cautious not to refer to this anything other than the Delta variant. It is the variant of concern. But what most of the news reports missed is that what Delta was doing is complicated, and the only reason why they were able to do it is, or even consider it, is because they are self-insured for their wellness program. There are ways, and I'm sure that there are accountants and others on this phone that are far more in tune with this than I am, but I got a great education from one of our ERISA partners on the complicated ways that and issues for doing anything with your wellness program, either as incentives or penalties, and the overlap of the Affordable Care Act, ERISA rules, EEOC requirements, HIPAA, and everything else. It is not easy to do. There's also growing sentiment, and I get it, that we're tired of this and we want to penalize those who are causing the problem, which is the unvaccinated. And that's a knee-jerk reaction that I'm hearing from a lot of executives and have been hearing for months. But fact is, it is easier to incentivize than to punish, and fewer legal issues. One of the big question marks is penalties for those who qualify for disability or religious reasons. And most of you flagged that on that particular question. And I want to be sure we're defining our terms right, as we'll go through later. People who are unvaccinated due to or get exemptions for religious or medical reasons, they can have consequences. They can be subject to safety rules or other requirements without it being discrimination. That may be testing, that may be masking, it may be other things. But there's a feeling that there's a gut difference between that and demoting people or taking away salary or putting cash disincentives from somebody who cannot get the vaccine for legal reasons. And so the penalties, something that feels like a penalty, is more likely to get challenged. So if you're thinking about all of this, could be a big headache. Well, you don't know the least of it till we get to the testing side. But you're going to have to weigh all of these burdens in the design of what you're going to do. And we're going to go through each of these in the following slides of the things that you're going to have to weigh. So we talked about the surveys. What we didn't talk about, and that I didn't include the slides on, before we get to testing, is documentation of vaccination. It's always the next question: what do I have to do? What's the best way to verify vaccination status? So there are basically 4 approaches. I think only 3 are available in Maryland. The first one is the honor system. And there are companies that still are using the honor system. You tell us that you're vaccinated, you attest that you basically say you're vaccinated. But the true honor system just says nobody should come in the office unless they're vaccinated, and we'll just trust you to be telling the truth. Very few employers are going with that way. The second one is give me the vaccine card. It may be electronic, it may be a physical copy, that is emailed. It may be checking actual cards. HR checks them and then notes them or makes a copy. And you've probably read there's a lot of fraud out there, and fake vaccine cards are becoming as common as fake certificates for emotional support animals and service animals are, with companies just grinding these out, and DOJ and the FTC can't shut them down fast enough. So you do have a fraud problem. The other option is attestation. That's basically any kind of written statement that says, yes, I am vaccinated, or I swear under penalty of perjury that I'm vaccinated. I actually like a longer form of that. If you're going to ask employees to make a statement, I think that the best mix is to get copies of cards, but then have a statement that basically said, I, Joe Schmo, say that I am vaccinated, that this card is mine, and I authorize you, if upon request, I will give you paperwork, or I will sign something to give you permission to go contact the hospital or the pharmacy or the state agency that gave me my test to verify that I am in fact vaccinated. You need something like that for HIPAA rules. So adding that level is going to reduce, probably not eliminate, but reduce the fraud and people lying about whether and giving in fake cards. There are some states or some pharmacies that maintain databases that can verify that somebody had a vaccination, and with permission, you can get access to that, or the employee can provide a verification from them. I don't know that any of that Maryland or any of the counties have got those that that are usable, but that may be a fourth option for some. And then all of that information has to be kept as confidential medical information, just like sick leave notes, FMLA notes, anything else. You're used to keeping that confidential. This is ADA confidential information. It is not HIPAA. But the ADA has only a short list of the kinds of disclosures you can make or who needs to know. So what I think is also helpful, either in the document that employees sign when they provide you with the proof of their card, or sometime later, will be permission for who you can share this information with, which supervisors are going to get this information. And the thing that we're seeing more often, I don't know if you will see it in your companies, but we are seeing more third parties who are saying that they need employers to either represent that everybody who comes onto their sites is vaccinated, or go further and say, we need evidence for our files that everybody who comes on our site to provide services is vaccinated. And if you've got clients, customers, government agencies making those kinds of requests, you're going to need a process and permission from your employees to share that information. So that's the highlights of the documentation issues. Testing. I don't think the administration has any clue what the issues are going to be and how complicated this is going to be possibly going to make. And I think you are going to have discretion to do this. If you have the discretion to how your testing program is developed, you're going to need to decide which tests, where, how they're going to be reported, whether they get paid, who pays for the cost, confidentiality, all of these issues. So let's start with the money issues. Do you have to pay your employees for the time spent getting tested? And the answer is probably yes. There's a FLSA, DOL past guidance and other kinds of testing, pretty clear. If I ask people to get tested on the job during working hours, or while waiting to clock in on arrival prior to clocking in, that's going to be compensable work time. And for your hourly non-exempt employees. And there's a DOL prior opinions. DOL has not said anything on this issue yet, but in the past, if you had mandatory medical tests that were a condition of coming to work or employment, then yes, that was compensable time. Now, start adding that up. All your unvaccinated employees tested once a week, and they have to drive down to the local CVS, wait however long until there's a pharmacist that can test them, and then come back, and you have them doing that. You can have a couple hours of extra compensable time, and yeah, that could lead to overtime issues too, if it's not built in. Now, I have found a possible de minimis exception for certain kinds of services performed outside of work that take less than 10 minutes, something between 5 and 10 minutes. And guess what? A rapid test takes about 2 minutes to administer once you've read the instructions. And then you don't have to wait around until you get the test result. But yeah, it probably is going to be compensable. How about the cost of the test? It really is a good question. OSHA is probably going to tell you that mandatory testing is to be at no cost to the employees. They said that in the healthcare setting. So for the half of you who are going to be covered by the OSHA rule, answer is probably. Health plan may cover testing, but then you can't, but if it's to be at no cost, what do you do about copays, deductibles in the new year? How do you handle all of that? The FLSA does not answer this question very clearly in the past. There are costs that can be required by law. They just can't reduce wages below minimum wage. And there are some rules on things like uniforms, but generally the FLSA doesn't address this. But there is some language in the EEOC guidance that if testing is the alternative to a mandate, then it's an accommodation, at least for those with disability or religious reasons. And maybe those employees don't have to pay while vaccinated, while people who are unvaccinated for other reasons might. In other words, it's a complex question and there is no clear answer yet. And we'll get at least some guidance from the OSHA rule, but this is one that we're still, nobody has the perfect answer on this one yet because it's complicated and no clear answers. Which tests to use? The rapid antigen tests, the ones you buy off the shelves if you can get them, very accurate for symptomatic employees. If people are starting to have symptoms of any kind, they're very good if you or your kids come home with sniffles, and if you want a quick answer whether the sniffles are COVID or not, you're likely going to get a pretty good answer from a rapid test. But they are not very accurate for asymptomatic conditions. So if somebody is, and you could just, so they're good if you want to have people test to let them come back in based on symptoms, but it's not a good way of finding out if unvaccinated employees have it, but don't know that they have it. That's going to be, it's got a much higher false negative rate. So all the other options involve going to healthcare providers, down to the local CVS or Walgreens, down to the local pharmacy, going to a doctor, whatever else. There is a rapid test available. It's more expensive, can be done on the spot. And the PCR tests, which if you've done them before, and many of us have, it's going to be 1 to 3 days for results. And who knows what's going to happen if suddenly millions of people need to have these every week. Now, I have a lot of clients that are looking at at-home rapid tests as being sufficient. First question that I ask them, do you trust them not to lie? Otherwise, you got to do it at work. Now, how are you going to handle unvaccinated employees? Who's going to do that while you sit there and wait for the results on their test? Even figuring out, if I want everybody coming to work Monday to show that they've had a negative COVID test, and I want a PCR test, how much lead time are we going to have it? That might mean that the test result, the result is within 48 hours, but it was tested 2 or 3 days before. Nothing of this is easy. Informed consent. A lot of people are going to miss this because it's buried elsewhere. EEOC guidance over a year ago said you can do medical testing, and testing would be job related and legal under the ADA if it's performed equivalent based on CDC guidance. So that means CDC guidance that might, on informed consent, that might look like it's just non-enforceable, in fact is enforceable because it's incorporated into CDC rules. So your testing protocol has to make certain that individuals read the inserts and understand the consequences and know what the test is and how it's being used, and some kind of template, standard information up front. Now, of course, once you give it up front, you don't have to do it a second time, but you have to deal with that. Then you need to keep confidential all this information and figure out, the reporting of it, how it's going to be reported to you in the results. And there are a lot of companies out there trying to come up with solutions for all of this. Your third-party administrators may be offering all of this as service and do turnkey. That may be appropriate for a lot of things except for exemptions. But a lot of third-party administrators of health plans are jumping into this business as an extra line. And then what are you going to do? More testing, more positive results. And this is just a summary of what the CDC's current rules are. If it's positive, they got to isolate and you're going to lose them for at least 10 days. Now, is that going to be paid or unpaid leave? And you're going to let them can they work remotely? Depends on the nature of the symptoms. And those are the rules. And if you get positive tests, you probably need to do contact tracing. And contact tracing could mean quarantines. If people have had close contact with the person who's now tested positive. You do weekly testing of all the unvaccinated, as you may have to do under the OSHA rule if it's an option for employees. It's going to be get complicated. So testing is not going to be pretty. And we'll know a whole lot more as the OSHA rules come out. But these are all the issues you've got to start thinking about right now. And there is no playbook that I've seen. I was having dinner with a pediatrician friend of mine the other day talking about safety protocols and what's the best practice if somebody, when somebody should test and which test should it be. And there's no consensus on this among doctors on how to space this if you're doing mass testing. You got to figure it out with the physicians that are going to help guide your particular company's practices. The lawyers can help somewhat, but this is also just a medical requirement. So we just touched on a few minutes before this whole issue of the consequences. Let's talk about that. The unvaccinated as a class are not protected under the ADA. They're not. And the EO said clearly you can impose other safety rules on employees with vaccine exemptions. So many of you right now are already following CDC guidance that everybody wears masks. But if you remember back in that brief period before Delta spiked, that we were running around without masks, those of us who are vaccinated and the unvaccinated weren't. Well, we may someday get back to that. And you can impose those consequences. And one of the things you can do for all employees right now, and probably should be, is proper wearing of CDC masks all day long. And I'm going out on a limb here, but I think I could, enforce that more rigorously against the unvaccinated to make certain that they are at greatest risk to others and to other unvaccinated people. So making certain it's the right CDC mask, which is all the multi-layers, worn properly, secure the mask, and that they're wearing it all day long, unless you have areas where they are exempt in a private office or other places. You can require the unvaccinated to be socially distanced or isolate them away from other people. That is, if it's feasible, you can do that. You can exclude the unvaccinated from the office, from in-person events, from meeting with clients and customers. One very popular issue, one of the reasons incentives for getting people back to the office is we can get back eating and drinking together again and socializing. I can exclude the unvaccinated from those events because the vaccinated folks are taking their masks off to eat and drink, and I don't want the unvaccinated there, whether masked or not. And that is a lawful exclusion. Does that include those who have exemptions? Yes, it does, because these are uniform safety requirements that you can impose. The ADA rule on this, even for people with disabilities, you can have uniform safety rules, like you must be this tall to take this ride. And you can impose those as long as they apply to everybody. So we've been talking a lot about exemptions. And this is an extremely complicated space that I'm going to try to simplify as much as I can. If you have any requirements of vaccination for anything, you have to consider under Title VII and the ADA and state laws exemptions for reasons. The minimum is disability accommodations under the ADA and any state law that prohibits discrimination based on disability. It's an exemption to vaccination. It doesn't mean you can't impose other requirements. Now, you have to decide, do I want to take a very hard line on this or a somewhat looser approach to this? If I limited this to people with disabilities who cannot get the vaccine because of CDC guidance, it's a very small list. It is primarily those who have severe allergic reactions to an ingredient in the vaccine and it's contraindicated. CDC recommends the vaccine for everybody else. Immunosuppressed individuals, long list in the CDC guidance of who they recommend it for. It's basically everybody with a handful of exceptions. Now, there are some deferrals. CDC recommends deferral for people who recently had COVID or certain treatments. CDC recommends pregnant women get the vaccine. Many doctors are still asking to delay. Most employers, if a pregnant woman comes to them and says, my doctor's still, I know what the guidance is. I've talked to 3 different OBs. And I've concluded based on this doctor, I want to not get it while I'm pregnant. Most of you are going to say yes, even though the CDC is making that recommendation. But the question you'll have is whether you will allow employees to present other medical excuses, and then how much you're going to push back on those. In every business person who deals with doctor's notes and leave issues and sickness knows you can get doctor's notes for almost anything. If a doctor says, my patient has this condition and it's my conclusion they should not get the vaccine, are you going to challenge that or not if it's not on the CDC's list? That's going to be probably your judgment call, and it's a risk management decision. One of the options on all of these is to say, I'm going to grant the exception at this time. That's my magic COVID language, at this time. We'll grant it now, but it's subject to review later. The doctor may change their mind, the patient may change their mind, but you'll grant it at this time for other reasons, or relook at it in 3 or 6 months. And that's what this slide is about, how much you're going to push back. If you grant the exemption, you have to consider alternatives: masking, distancing, limiting in-person contact, even remote work. Question is whether or not, having done that, what do you do with a unvaccinated person who has lots of direct in-person contact during the day? A office manager or a staff person who is in the office and around people every single day. Can I say that that person, even with masking and testing, can be excluded because of the risk of others? And under the ADA, if it's a medical reason, the answer is probably not. It's a very, very high standard to exclude people under the ADA for safety reasons. This is all case by case. I'm not setting a hard and fast rule, but it's a higher legal standard. And I call it the direct threat standard. Any of you have dealt with safety issues under the ADA, this should be familiar for you. You can consider how many others need the accommodation, but you're only going to have a handful of people with legitimate medical exemptions. So, quick question. You got 80 employees, 90% of your folks are vaccinated, but you've got 2 who have medical documentation. Can you terminate the 2 for medical exemption due to risk? Yeah, that's close enough. The yeses, you got to do a case-by-case analysis. I probably haven't given you enough facts. You may end up giving based on the situation, but not sure is a good answer. That not sure is really, I need a whole lot more facts and I need to have more than 30 seconds to analyze this. And I'm comfortable with that, the not sures. But it's going to be tough to make the standard and get the direct threat standard. I didn't give you enough time with the slides to really sort of consider that. But the answer is yes. It's going to be a challenge to say they are a direct threat. If there's a significant risk of substantial harm right now, what is the risk of an unvaccinated person who's getting weekly testing and is wearing their mask properly to the vaccinated or unvaccinated people around them. And nobody is going to say it's an elevated risk, but how high? Until there were vaccines, that's what we were all doing. We were wearing masks and social distancing. And most of us were not doing testing. And that was the best practices 6 months ago. So that's going to be a challenge. Religious exemptions. You're going to get a lot of these. And there's a lot of guidance in the past on religious exemptions, including for vaccination. And these are not easy. There's extensive guidance on it. And a lot of lawyers are having to dust up on old EEOC guidance on all of these issues, because you're going to have to consider exemptions for religious beliefs. A couple basic rules. Religion can include lots of different things. It can be the church of the 20 people who believe that they're part of the kunuist religion that drives down the great rivers of life and believes that they should be smoking peyote the entire time. Small number of people, and it may seem illogical, but it may be a religion. And a belief and practice can be religious, even if the majority in that sect or denomination don't follow it. The one we're seeing all the time these days, very common, is people doing cut and paste objections and coming with pastor letters saying, I object to the vaccination because a fetal stem cell tissue was used in the testing, development, or manufacture of this test. And the first response is, particularly when it's Catholics who raise this, is, well, the Pope says it's fine. Well, the fact that the Pope says it's okay to take these vaccines doesn't mean they can't have a strong religious belief. But then there are questions about how to challenge it. I'll talk about that in a second. What are not religious beliefs? Moral, philosophical, political religions, opposition to natural food folks who just don't want any kind of medications, but particularly the political and philosophical objections to vaccination, a lot of anti-vax beliefs. Anti-vax is not religious if it's not based upon spiritual belief in a higher power as the sole reason for their opposition. Now, this is where it forces employers to start second guessing people's religious beliefs. And do you want to do that? Do I want to decide, is this a sincere religious belief or not? Or do I want to accept it right now and move on to the second part of the test? So ordinarily, you might assume it's true, but if you have a basis for questioning it, you can question and request supporting information. You can test the validity of the belief. For example, in the fetal tissue situation, there is truth that 2 of the vaccinations did use fetal stem cell tissue early in the testing, but it's not used in the development or manufacture or in production of those vaccines. But the question that can be raised back to the employees is, what else have you done in your past, or are you going to do in the future to ensure that every other medication you've taken also has not had fetal stem cells used in the testing? Saw a hospital last week that had come up with a list of 100 plus common drugs, everything from Tums to Tylenol to everything else, and lots of prescribed medications, all of which use fetal stem cells in the initial testing or development of these tests. And nobody has ever, very few people have done the research in the past or cared about it. This particular hospital is telling people, fine, I'll grant your request as long as you vow never to take any of these medications or any of the others in the future. I think that's a little overbroad, but I get it. So you can push back, or you can sit here and say, I'm going to accept this at this time. And now let's go to the next step. What's going to happen if I grant this request for right now? So you got to think about the alternatives, just like you have to do with the disability. But under Title VII or under state laws for religion, the standard for how much burden you need, it's the same term, undue hardship, that's the defense. But in this context, it means more than a de minimis burden or cost on you or others. And if granting the exemption is more than a de minimis burden on you in many ways or cost. You don't have to provide the exemption and do that. So you can certainly require them to engage in safety requirements, masking, social distancing, testing. You may get some that say the mask violates my religion because I'm covering the face of God, and the test violates me because it's an invasive test, and I don't believe in invasive tests. Rarely do those hold up to scrutiny, but you may get some of those. Work from home is a possibility, but I've got clients who want to say, I have people doing a lot of in-person stuff. They're around people every day. They're seeing patients, they're seeing customers, they're seeing clients in person frequently. And I think that they are such a risk, even while doing testing and masking, that's more than a de minimis burden because of the risk to others. And therefore, I want to terminate everybody who is asking for a religious exemption because they all pose an elevated risk. I think that I'm going to fire everybody who raises a religious exemption is a highly risky way to do it. Some employers are going to try it, but the idea of looking position by position, case by case, and saying some of our employees have such customer-facing, client-facing activities, or we have so many customers demanding that only vaccinated people serve them because of the risks, that it's essential for those people and their jobs that they be vaccinated. And I can't accommodate that remotely. So I may have to demote them, put them in a new position, or ultimately fire them for that. One other thing on this, coworker and customer requirements. Customers who ask for vaccinated people, that's legal, and they can. Customers refuse to accept people because they have religious exemptions or medical exemptions alone. That would violate the law. Coworker fear isn't enough. And particularly fear of unvaccinated people, including those with religious or medical beliefs. It's like saying my coworkers don't want to work around somebody who's Black. And you can't use coworker bias or fear or supervisor fear as a basis. So using that same example, if I've got 4 people with religious exemptions, would you push back, or would you accept it and go the other direction? Gut instinct. Denise, we got poll 6. All right. Failing poll 6. I am going to pause this here, stop share, go back. We have got 17 minutes. And I want to look in the chat first to see what we have. And then I want to open up for question. I've got some return to office, return to work slides that we can touch on the end, but I want to go into chat and see what happens. So let's see. So from Bridget, what written documentation can be required for a religious exemption? The short law, Bridget, legally is you can't require anything, you can invite it. And there are at least 2 major religions, and Christian Scientists are one of the most well-known, and a number of smaller, lesser-known religions that that one of their key tenets is opposition to all medical interventions. And so individuals who are members of those faiths will be able to provide religious documentation or point to the tenets of their religion or somebody to support that they've been, a member. So they will have extra documentation. You can't turn people down just because they have no documentation, because they may be holding beliefs that are just personal and sincere to them. and that they've held a long time, but that there's nobody else in their faith that backs up what they believe. And you will, but actually you are going to get medical documentation. And if it starts looking familiar, it's because there are, a growing number of sites that basically are providing template letters or language or Bible verses to insert or fill in the blanks or other things. And many of these come with pastors' letters, priest letters. There are churches that by just asking, quote, churches that just by asking for information about vaccinations and masks, you are now a member of this particular minister's church, and he will then, you can then download his standard letter or the fill-in blank one for you. You will get documentation. Much of it will not be focused on religion. It will have other objections. Many of these are based upon bad science or inaccurate facts, but you're going to get it. Is natural immunity a valid exemption? No. Glad somebody asked like that. No. What you have is you are told, CDC recommends that if you've had COVID-19, you wait 90 days so that you don't have interactions with the natural antibodies. But while everybody gets some natural immunity, that's going to fade. And we don't know how quickly it can fade, but the fact that the vaccination is recommended for people 90 days after COVID symptoms have expired should give you an indication. People will say, I don't need it because I feel fine and I have natural immunity. And it's no, that is not religious, that is not medical, that has no basis legally and can be ignored. Let's see, apologize if some of the slides weren't working earlier. If we do a hard mandate, can we terminate employee if they refuse based on religious, medical, or reasons? And that was, Buddy, the issue that I was getting to in the last slides is no, not automatically. You first have to exhaust or at least consider all of those other alternatives, other safety protocols, proper masking, weekly testing, social distancing. Can this employee do their job remotely, which eliminates any of the risk? Can you reassign duties, or is it essential that they be in person? And even if the answer, and then the question are they still what degree of danger are they in the workplace? If I've got a 95% vaccinated workplace and 3 people who are unvaccinated and they're getting tested weekly and properly wearing their masks all the time and limiting their in-person contact during the day, what's my medical elevated risk? I don't know, and I don't think any scientist can give you a conclusive answer to how much greater risk they are. I do know that that is going to be less than what you need for a direct threat analysis, probably. I shouldn't say absolutely. Direct threat is a very high standard. So if it is a legitimate medical or disability excuse, you're going to have a hard time terminating them. For the religious exemptions, you have arguments to make that you could terminate because of safety risk, but you really need to think through. You will need to defend both, the denying the religious exemption or saying that they have an elevated risk, and be prepared if the EEOC comes knocking to demonstrate the analysis you went through and why it was an elevated safety risk, and defend it. And your lawyer is going to have a fun time defending that. I think it's possible. That's a long answer, but it's going to be it's one of the most common ones we're getting. Okay. That's all I see in the chat here. I am going to open this back up then also for anybody who wants to ask follow-up questions verbally or cover other issues and open up. A lot of content. So what are your next questions other than what in the world am I getting myself into next? Feel free to unmute if you like to rather than the chat. Nothing? Okay. So while you're thinking here, and we got another few more minutes, When you get the slides, I'm going to have some actual slides on return to office. I want to touch on those. For those of you who are not back in the office yet, and are struggling with where to go forward, there is no roadmap, and the diversity of this group on the roadmap, what you're going to do for return to office, what your requirements are going to be, how you're going to operate in the future. Actually, I will pop this back on up since I was right here. Let's just go back on down. Sorry for that delay. Okay. So I spent a lot of time outside of COVID just talking about return from office, work from home. And, you may have heard the old adage, it takes, 3 months or 6 months to create a habit and at least a year to break it. But after a year, habits are almost automatic. And it's now been 18 months. And for those of you who've gone back to the office, sometimes or a lot, if it feels awkward, it's because working from home is natural and you're used to it. You're used to the flex time. Let's be honest, it's not just work from home, it's flex time. As long as the work gets done, or as long as I clock my hours, unless you're really having people watch the clock, they're flexing their life. They're doing other things for when and how things get done. They're dealing with the kids and the school issues. And that is here to stay. There is no place where you have to require remote work. No duty to accommodate employee concerns about bringing home the virus to others. One of the few areas where you might get a legitimate request for remote work as an accommodation is for immunosuppressed employees who are vaccinated, but who are not generating enough antibodies and whose doctors say that being in an office, even a highly vaccinated office, still poses too much risk. That's something we're going to have to consider. You may in the future get some requests for other kinds of work from home from people with Crohn's or other disabilities that make it really hard to be in the office environment or commute. We have to think about those differently than we did 2 years ago because of those experiences. But most of the people who say, I need to work from home out of concerns about the virus or concerns about unvaccinated coworkers, that's not a legitimate disability exemption. You're not going to have to consider it. But figuring out how to get people back to the office, when and how often. There are employers who simply say, I said so, and I'm making you come in because, and I want everything to be back to normal. And those employers that are choosing to do that are going to find that a lot of people are going to walk with their feet. What roughly, the great resignation is also the great dissatisfaction with work life and culture. And if you are not offering flexibility, your competitors are going to. People are going to have options and it's the same reason why many unvaccinated people will have the option to walk to somebody who doesn't require the same level of mandates. Now, at a certain size company, after the OSHA rules, that's going to be harder. But the flex time and hybrid work issues are going to be hard. And hybrid just is not easy. I am working with a number of different clients, major companies, just trying to figure out what the natural mix is. And if you follow the business news and all the major papers, you're seeing these articles regularly, and you have for the last 6 months, the hesitation by everybody to get back into the office, how many people still are, and figuring out, why are we coming back to the office? What's the purpose? How do I make certain that people are in there on core days? How do I make certain that there's coverage every day for staff people or for certain things? How do I integrate those that are remote? How do I get collaboration in the hybrid environment? How do I recreate the culture that we have? And the only thing I can tell you at the end of the day is that this is going to be a process, and this is a process that's going to take us at least a year, 18 months to settle into. And whatever you're trying, you're going to have to keep tweaking and trying and experiment, and some things are going to work and some things are not. And figuring out what the blend is that fits your culture, that makes people feel like they have more control and more flexibility over their life than they had in the past, that they're not losing that completely, and creates the reasons why people want to be in the office, in the workplace, even if they could otherwise do their job remotely. Now, for those of you who are in the frontline business and have people who are just frontline all the time, they don't have that option. And but in those companies, you got to understand that there's been a lot of frustration between those who have been providing frontline services while you've been working from home, and the executives and managers have. So there are no answers, but the other thing, and this has been true since day one, flexibility. Conditions change, viruses mutate, new regs come down. Things are going to change going forward. Who knows how long it'll take for commuting patterns to adjust depending on who's in the office. The only thing my wife said is, we were talking about this the other day, she said, one thing I know is if in DC, if the federal government picks Wednesday as their core day, you don't want to pick Wednesday as one of your core days because that'll be the one day with the heavier traffic. So this is just not easy. It's not easy stuff. And it's complicated. And oh, Denise says she's now going to launch a bonus question. Okay, sounds fine. So having got there, before the bonus question and the wrap up, any other questions? I don't see any of the chat. Anything else while you're getting free legal advice here for the last 30 seconds on these issues? Oh, I should say, and this is not legal advice. This is solely for advisory purposes. Yes, Lynn, that perked you up.
I just had and I don't even know that I have a formulated question here, but we are seeing within our client base more COVID positives with vaccinated employees. And so I'm just curious, I guess, if others are seeing that as well and how that's being addressed. And I don't know the legal.
I'll save everybody the trouble. Breakthrough infections are natural. They are common. An individual I know who is an immunologist and who has done everything possible to protect herself ended up with a breakthrough infection and on vacation. And it happens. It's going to happen. Some will be severe. Most will be asymptomatic. You don't know. And breakthrough is probably a bad term because, you know, the vaccines were always intended to do their best work with preventing hospitalization, death, severe illness. And most of these cases of people who get infected are mild, and many of them are asymptomatic. So we will get that. It doesn't change, you know, what some people are doing is testing more of their, now, if I get an infection, the person who I'm at greatest risk to is to the unvaccinated employee. Let's be honest, it is hard to transmit from a vaccinated person to another vaccinated person. Not impossible, but it's hard. So there is an argument we should be doing random or periodic testing for our vaccinated employees as well. But at some point, you can't load on too many burdens to getting vaccination because we work so hard to up those numbers. So the vaccinated people want to feel that there is some benefit to have gotten vaccinated when it comes to the workplace. But yes, everybody will see it. And if you haven't had close friends or family members or others, you've heard about it from somebody else by now, I guarantee you. So. And
I do have just one other question in terms of that, and I saw Joe pop on, so I know we're wrapping up, but the idea that some people are coming into the office with like a sniffle or a cough, and they are wearing masks, let's say, from a policy standpoint, some people just don't, if they've been vaccinated, they just don't want to get a COVID test because maybe that means that they will need to stay home, for example. And then, like you said, if the symptoms are not that great, but is there a workplace policy that would need, that would be considered? Because it could be allergies. Let's just say, right?
There is the practice, if not policy, that is probably best for that is that if you are having symptoms that are on the list of COVID symptoms, the long list, you take a rapid test. And if it's positive, you stay home. If it's negative and until your symptoms get worse, and suddenly you lose your sense of taste and smell, but if it's negative, test again in a couple of days. That's what the CDC would say, is you'd retest on the rapid test. You go in the office, you wear your masks, take the rapid test again. And if it's still negative, you're probably fine as a vaccinated person. And because you don't want people coming in when it might be allergies or sniffles, but it might be COVID. So that's the perfect situation for the rapid test at home. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Rob, I want to thank you and Jackie and all of Saul Ewing for making this presentation possible. Denise, if you could unmute yourself, I've got a question. Will this presentation be on the website so that people can share with others within their organization?
Yes, it may take a day to get the recording put over to YouTube, but I'll email everybody as soon as the recording and the slide deck are posted to the website. Oh, and Joe, I need to pop up one more question since we had that technical difficulty. Let me just pop up a fun one quickly so people can get their CPE credit.
Okay.
Okay, this is just a silly one.
American. So again, Rob, thanks so much. This has been timely, informative, and extremely interesting. And we want to thank you and Saul Ewing for continuing not only this presentation, for being our sponsor. And I hope everyone can make it out to our next live event in Columbia at Interlinks in October. So we hope to see you then. And Graham's going to give out free samples from the bank, right, Graham?
All the coin rolls you can find, no coin included.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Until we have our next presentation, safe travels.